Good evening, everyone, and welcome to another edition of our Justice and Pieces guest speaker series. As we've been talking to paralegal and lawyer bencher candidates here in advance of the 2023 Law Society bencher elections. As always, the views and opinions are of the candidates alone. They don't reflect me, Justice and Pieces, Trials College, or any other education institution or organization I'm affiliated with. Today evening, we have Quinn joining us. So first of all, thanks so much, Quinn, for speaking with us.
Not at all. Thanks for having me. Nice to be here.
And Quinn, maybe you could start. Tell us a little bit about yourself. I know you're an incumbent bencher, so tell us a bit about your practice and everything.
Sure, absolutely. Quinn Ross, Southwest Region. I am the managing partner of a regional firm in Southwestern and Central East, actually. So we have offices in Stratford, Goderich, Kincardine, Walkerton, Port Elgin, and Owen Sound. I am primarily in the practice of corporate commercial law. I also have a large linear expropriation practice where I represent landowners who are subject to large infrastructure expropriations. And aside from that, just trying to herd 70 cats on a daily basis keeps me pretty busy.
Now, Quinn, you are, or I guess you still are a bencher, in advance of the election here, and you're seeking a second term now. Perhaps you could tell us why you're running again.
I ask myself that question on the daily. No, in all seriousness, I think that there's a lot of work left to be done. And admittedly, from my own experience on boards, which is relatively extensive, we didn't get a lot done during the time that I got to spend in convocation. It was a very challenging convocation. And I think with the rapid evolution of technology, with the pressing crisis of access to justice, as well as just the opportunity for regulatory reform that still exists right now, and all of the great pressures that are militating in favor of those things moving forward, an opportunity to get the real sophisticated, challenging work done over the next 4 years is something that I really look forward to, because I just don't feel like I got done what I wanted to during my first term.
And I guess how would you characterize then and I know it was the 2 and a bit for you there, coming in partway, but what was sort of the things that you'd like to have seen get done that you didn't get done, and sort of what was the temperature, at convocation over the last couple of years in terms of perhaps why some of those things didn't get done in your opinion?
Moving the dial forward on some of the larger regulatory pieces took far longer than I think it should have. So the FLSP piece just really dragged. There was a lot of sort of glancing and somewhat facile looks at it by certain members of convocation, sending it back to committee, complaints about process, complaints about transparency of information, as opposed to really just sort of digging in and understanding the issues and seeing what we can do to make that very important step towards an increase in access to justice. A lot of time was spent on issues that would normally be largely perfunctory because they were splashy, because they could get sound bites and they could be used for political and or media advantage. Things like the budgeting process, which is, as I'm sure you can imagine, in $100 million a year company that also owns an insurance company, a complex, disciplined, and detailed process undertaken by staff and audit and finance. The work is done. There's an opportunity for everyone to participate in viewing the outcomes of those work, and then you move through the budget in the normal course to attempt to ascertain where efficiencies can be found without cutting against the core mandate. And instead of spending the time doing that, which is relatively contracted in the normal course because the heavy lifting has been done by committee and staff, as it should be in something of this size with this sophistication, grandiose, opportunistic claims were made by certain members of convocation in order to gain points where those points really weren't available. Big lever approaches to budgeting on an organization like that just don't make sense. If you're not looking at where your cut's going to impact, you shouldn't be suggesting a cut. If you haven't done the work, you shouldn't make the claim. And so we were just constantly caught on issues like that, and issues of, people chalking things up to identity politics, to a social engineered agenda of some kind that simply did not exist, in order to, again, have the opportunity to get those really cute sound bites. I remember debating whether because there is a territorial acknowledgement, so too should there be the God Save the Queen saying immediately thereafter. These were the types of things that we spent time on. And as I said, I've been on a few boards, and I've been on some relatively complex ones with larger organizations. And that's not the work. The work is understanding the jurisdictional and legislative mandate, or business mandate, as the case may be, of the entity, and working with staff in order to best steer it to achieve that goal and to discharge your fiduciary duty. It's not an opportunity to throw buns, to be uncivil, and to look for opportunities to make a splash when it's really not about the work.
Now, in terms of, I guess, making splashes, I mean, this election certainly different than the last time you were running in terms that, you're running as part of the Good Governance Coalition. And the last time, I mean, a little bit different as well, in that you had the then Statement of Principle, Stop group, I think 22 of them in total that were running and got elected.
Mm-hmm.
And now, there's sort of that process there, or does that really work in a board of directors, in terms of our benchers? But now you have your Good Governance Coalition group, now 45 strong, 40 lawyers and 5 paralegal bencher candidates. And you're saying essentially, well, that slate, there was a problem there, but we're running together. It's okay, because if we're elected, we will look at electoral reform where we may not necessarily need slates to continue in the future, which kind of has sort of this, is this hypocritical? I mean, what are they really saying here? So is there a way kind of you can maybe explain and as well compare running from the last time to running this time of, is that a necessary step, and why?
When we looked at the results, first of all, I agree with everything you said. I think it is hypocritical, excuse me. And I think it's anathema to the organization we're attempting to be elected to govern. I also think it's the politicization of an organization that should be the very last organization to be politicized. But let me parse this a bit. In 2019, a bloc with a singular agenda campaigned as a slate and achieved a resounding victory as a result of a vote split of the independents. Statistically borne out. The reason they won is because they aggregated all the votes for their slate where everyone else split votes amongst themselves. There should be no slates. My primary mandate, and as you said, the only shared policy position of the Good Governance Coalition, is to ensure that slates do not continue. That obviously requires legislative reform, so we don't have absolute control over it. But to the extent that we are going to be advocating for and seeking that, that's the only policy position of the Bencher Good Governance Coalition. The difference, I suppose, now, it's the prisoner's dilemma to a certain extent. You don't have to vote for either. You don't have to vote for the Good Governance Coalition, but if you don't, in our estimation, and based on past experiences predict your future behavior, the slate will win again, but this time with 30 some odd candidates. So they will have a majority and be able to continue as they have in the last convocation. And I'll talk a little bit about what that was in a moment. The Good Governance Coalition, by contrast, is a necessary evil that seeks to end its own ability to ever repeat the behavior, and has undertaken to maintain independence and individuality with respect to policy and voting. There will be no block voting. There was block voting with the slate, and it necessitated, to a certain extent, for those who weren't on the slate to consider whether they too needed to vote in a block, and it removed pure voting of conscience, which is what should be happening in an organization like the Law Society. The reason why it is a necessary evil, albeit hypocritical, is because a continued convocation, now populated with even more members sharing the same mindset as the last 4 years, fundamentally threatens self-regulation. This is not a big lever. This is a nuanced, complex, legal social entity that has roles within our civil society in terms of the protection of the rule of law and the separation of powers. And it has relationships with stakeholders where we don't hold all the cards, but we are beholden to some of those stakeholders. For example, the provincial government, who legislates the act under which we actually find our self-regulation. Given another 4 years of wandering around and kicking at things, I am confident that the already strained relationships that have been created during the last convocation as a result of the slate mandate and inexperience and naivete and approach will compound, and it will give the government and the public the opportunity to say, we've had enough of this circus. You do not deserve the right to regulate yourself. You're not competent to do so, and we're going to remove that ability. So that's why, despite loathing the concept of participating as a member of any group in an election of this kind, I have done so purely because I do believe if I don't, I will not win as an independent, which would be fine if everyone was independent. But similarly, the slate will, and they will carry on to do further damage to the Law Society.
So you characterize it as damage to the Law Society. I mean, and on the other side, they'd say the Law Society has lost its ways, and now you say good governance, and then they'll say big governance, right?
Yeah.
So, I mean, what was going on then? I mean, in terms of the last few years there, that if it continues, you're saying, well, this is going to lead to potentially self-regulation, right? It may seem, or to someone on the outside, that, is this like a leap? Is this sort of like, well, if you don't do this, this is going to happen, kind of like the fear being instilled in the voters? But maybe you can kind of explain to those, I mean, not just myself, but anyone listening that may not know as much of what's going on or what was happening, of why you've said essentially that if they are elected again, this is a very likely possibility.
When you turn the Law Society into an advocacy arm of the legal profession, and you direct that incredibly big advocacy arm to start smashing at siloed institutions like the government that control, for example, the courts, that control our act, that control the appointment of judges, and you simply say, no, I don't think that working with these stakeholders in the manner that provides for give and take, as is necessary in these big complex relationships, makes sense any longer. We need to go in there and we need to tell them, because we're getting ripped off as lawyers. That's in its best light. I think it's even more facile than that. But if that's the approach, then those relationships come to an end, and the work that we're supposed to be doing can't happen. We don't have the only steering wheel in this big machine. There are others with incredibly important steering wheels. And that is fundamentally the part that was missed. So that's it, right? That's outward stakeholder stuff, right? We can't go around punching people in the face all the time. We have to work with them. And even if it is frustrating, there are problems. There's problems that we need to fix. And if the Law Society had a magic wand and they could make the law schools do what they want to do, and they could make the law firms do what they want to do, and they could make the government do what they want to do, things would be different, but we don't. So we have to work with them. And it's a process of give and take. It's complex, and it requires statespersonship, like it or not. I'd love to change the system so it didn't, but presently it does. That has been fundamentally lacking. And what we've got instead is a Yahoo with a bullhorn on a soapbox saying all the things that a certain group of lawyers want to hear to these large monolithic entities, as though that's going to have any impact other than pissing them off. And that's the only impact it's had, and it will continue. So that's part one. Part two is the clown show. So out in the world, people are seeing this nonsense in convocation, and they're asking themselves, what are these people up to? Like, I get enough of this when I watch Question Period. That's disturbing enough. But the profession and the public are both looking at convocation and going, to the extent that anyone's interested, but it's been in the news a lot, probably more in the last 4 years than in the 16 preceding, and it's never good. So the confidence in the public and the administration of justice and the regulation of the profession, and the confidence in the government that we can handle our affairs and make sure that this profession of 70,000 lawyers and paralegals is properly regulated, that confidence gets shaken. And that's how you lose self-regulation. So I don't think that I'm fear-mongering. I'm simply saying we have a bunch of people who either don't know how to do the job or won't do the job they know they are supposed to do because it's not as fun, it's not as splashy as just yelling. And they're out there in the world making big, big waves that could come back to harm us. I'm not certain it would happen, but I'm confident. And I think it's serious enough that everyone should be paying very close attention to this election. And then let me just talk about the characterization of the Good Governance Coalition, because you touched on that as well. I started in a firm of 3 lawyers, and I've grown it. I'm in a rural jurisdiction. I've never practiced on Bay Street. I come from one of the only sections of the province that consistently has conservative MPs. This is not a woke jurisdiction I'm living in. I have no debase social agenda that I want to force on the lawyers in the public of Ontario. And I am one person within a group of individuals. I would love to see board reform. Before we went live, you and I were talking about it. I think the board should be smaller. I think the approach to electing the board should be changed. I think there should be some consideration of skills-based approaches to the people who are governing the profession and managing a $100 million a year corporation in the process. So the problem with attempting to paint us with the same brush is that it's just an impossibility. We are a diverse group of people. The only thing we share in common, aside from that original policy piece, is competency and experience. You just compare the resumes. I sent out a missive recently and I said, this election is not a popularity contest. It's a competency contest. And that is the absolute truth. That should be the only thing people concern themselves with, because the rest of these sort of mythical agendas and terrifying outcomes that are being suggested by the other side just never existed and certainly don't exist in this election.
So maybe let's get back to what you were saying about what should the Law Society be doing, and in terms of as a regulator, again, in the public interest, right, the mandate to the public, if elected, and if you're able to kind of come together with the rest of convocation and return back to certainly addressing some of these issues. What should they be? What should the Law Society be doing? What's their role in, if ideally everything is working effectively, what would you like to be doing?
I mean, if I understand the question correctly, it assumes that everything's working effectively. I would start with that being incorrect. Everything is not working effectively at all. So again, the key players in this sort of continuum is the academy, the law schools, the Law Society, and the marketplace, the legal professionals that hire and employ lawyers and then deliver legal services or paralegal services. The Law Society can only control that middle piece and license the latter piece and regulate the latter piece. It doesn't control the market, and it can't tell the schools what to do, and probably for good reason. But we're failing even within our own regulatory mandate, which is to regulate the lawyers of the province of Ontario in the public interest, and to, where possible within that mandate, expand and increase access to justice. So number one for me is that we have done a very bad job at expanding and increasing access to justice because there is a certain amount of self-interest in our regulation. I think also we are not nimble enough to contemplate and anticipate opportunities for partnership with technology that would allow lawyers and paralegals to do more efficiently and more accessibly than we are right now. We are so far behind every other professional services industry on the planet. Now, I understand we've got additional complexities. I get that. But we've used that excuse for an awful long time, decades. I think it's time that we solve the hard problems so that we can have access to these solutions that are low-hanging fruit and readily available. I've already talked about board reform. I also believe that we've got work to do, and this isn't a progressive agenda. It is a statement of fact in case law at the Supreme Court, at the Human Rights Commission, in pretty much any reasonable report that anyone could do. There is not equal partition in either the profession of law or those people who are able to access the legal services. That's a reality. And as stewards of the rule of law, the application of all laws equally to all people, we have to sort that out. And if that means we do it directly through EDI initiatives, fantastic. If that means we have to continue to support evolutions in jurisprudence that acknowledges certain barriers being systemic and adjust for them, outstanding. Certainly it means that we have to uphold our responsibilities under the Human Rights Code, which seem to be a big problem for some people. But those are the things we need to be doing. We need to be positioning the regulator to be nimble and out in front on technological advances and the connections between the law and those advances, especially. I mean, everybody's saying it, but ChatGPT, it's not going to be the end of lawyers, but it's going to fundamentally change how we do things. We need to increase access to justice through those advances, and we have to look at how the regulator itself is structured. It is big, cumbersome, and highly traditional.
So let's unpack each of those points there, if we can, to the technology there, right? In terms of what to get ahead of. I mean, I don't know if necessarily you'll always be ahead, but to kind of address whether it's Chat GPT, right? I mean, I've been talking how it's passed some bar exams, medical exams, and so forth, and how that role, or what the role in terms of technology within a law firm structure, in terms of you're reducing work, in terms of the various the rules of professional conduct that may be touched on. Kind of what does the law society need to be doing in terms of all of that, right? With respect to the technology piece and the lawyering piece, right? Of how they all kind of come together. What, as a regulator, what should they be doing?
So I'll make some friends and I'll make some enemies on this one. And I guess that's elections. So what they are doing is the Access to Innovation Sandbox, which is a great idea, a little late. We've seen these sandboxes in the financials, like in the OSC and in other professional services sectors and incubators for a very long time, where they're allowed to really do some pretty blue sky stuff inside the sandbox in order for the regulator to understand how you can frame around something so amorphous, because our regulatory framework is really square. Here's the lines. It's your job to fit inside of it. We're not going to tell you how to do that, but we'll tell you once you're out of it. That's an incredibly challenging and rigid construct for something moving as quickly as the technology we're seeing today. And the A2I, unfortunately, the Access to Innovation is sort of built on that construct. Here's the 17-page application for your SASS, and if you want to do it, and then we'll review it and we'll let you know, and maybe you'll come up with a product that you can take to market either directly to consumer or in favor of lawyers. That is not blue sky regulatory sandbox. Blue sky regulatory sandbox is having someone come in there with AI and run a law firm with it, with one lawyer and 17 clerks and a bunch of AI, and see what happens. Those are the kinds of things that the regulator should be taking on, not waiting for someone who wants to sell a product coming to their doorstep, but anticipating the evolutions and playing with them to see what their actual real life impacts are, as opposed to slowly and haltingly allowing the profession to drag them 10 years after, 5 years after. I mean, our cycles are shortening, as are everyone else's, but some period after the thing has actually landed everywhere else, and slowly drag them to a point where they say, okay, well, we've moved the line. We don't know what's actually beyond the line, but we'll tell you if we see it. That's not a place where innovation and evolution is going to naturally foment. So we have to fundamentally change how we approach regulation in order to make it more flexible, in order to provide more room for these things to happen. There's got to be some room for good faith attempts at genuine progress, while still maintaining the core ethical duties, where you don't stand to have the law society take your license away as though you've just committed some mortal sin. So philosophically and structurally, those changes need to take place.
Now, we were talking before even about potential electoral reform, whether it's around just coming together as a coalition or as a slate, or I mean, the amount of votes you may get, or the size of the board, or I mean, any sort of idea along those lines. I mean, we're looking, I mean, maybe in the context of low voter turnout and what maybe can stimulate that. And I guess we can see after this election if there's any change from 2019. But I mean, have you given thought in terms of any other sort of ideas, or maybe you can certainly share what your thoughts are on those issues in terms of how can the Law Society board, or the group of benchers, at convocation or board meeting, however you want to phrase it, but how can it be more efficient?
Let me count the ways. Okay, so 53 voting members, or 53 members, 45 in convocation, plus X treasurers. Formerly, there were life benchers. They don't have votes anymore, but there are a lot of bodies. And staff is not insignificant, although it's a big place attempting to regulate 70,000 humans. So there's going to be a lot of staff. This model of board just isn't a thing anymore. It just is not efficient or effective. Having 45 people debating something that's already been through a committee process that is akin to legislature, like the staffing and discipline that's done in these committees is something to behold. It's no joke. And then it is debated by people who may or may not have read the material ad nauseum. Not a great way to run a complex board. I do believe that it should be smaller. I think that there's an inherent conflict in the way that the board is impaneled in first instance. So you've got lawyers elected by lawyers who don't represent the lawyers they're elected by, and the lawyers who elect them, by and large, not all of them, but a good number of them believe that they're then constituents as a result of, I voted for you. You are my representative in the Law Society. No. You voted for me to regulate you. I am the Public of Ontario's representative in convocation. So it may be easier. I believe fundamentally that the board should always be impaneled by lawyers. I think that's critical. But I think that there should be some skills-based component to their impanelment. And I'm not entirely sure that election is the best way to go about it. It always begs the question then, who is the decider? And that is the scary part. And that's a part easily solved by lawyers voting. So whether it's a combination of a smaller board and lawyers voting as they do now, or a smaller board and lawyers voting with fewer votes or votes within their own jurisdiction in order to make it obviously more relevant to them and hopefully increased interest, I don't know. I do know that it needs to be investigated and it absolutely needs to be decreased.
And then the last point I think you brought up, we were talking about EDI that you mentioned, and again, on different people I've talked to or sort of reading about, right? I mean, it kind of, on the messaging on the Full Stop website there, you have the stop bloat, stop creep, stop woke. And again, it's looking at perhaps the Law Society in terms of now addressing these issues, how, I mean, sometimes it's framed as the Law Society as a regulator should be doing less in terms of governance, let's say, in terms of some people saying, and more focused on, competencies, right? And looking at the profession. And I mean, on the other side, I mean, even you have court decisions that say, cultural competency is important. Like you need to know sort of your clients, right? I mean, that's sort of a component, or trauma-informed lawyering and things like that. So again, kind of looking at that in that perspectives, or the different perspectives there of what the Law Society should be doing on that, and what maybe can be done from other organizations, SABA, Cable, CBA, OBA, whatever. I mean, again, from your experience being a bencher already and addressing all of those points, kind of where do you see the Law Society, or where should the Law Society position themselves in navigating all of those EDI issues?
I think we should stick to our knitting, but we've got a job to do. So obviously, as a massive employer and a corporation, there's an obligation for the board to ensure that we are doing our job pursuant to the existing legislation regarding human rights, and that we are good corporate citizens. And that includes, and I don't think that this is shocking to suggest, an EDI component in pretty much everything you do. I think everything should be viewed through a lens that ensures everyone's getting a fair shake. And if I'm misquoted to somehow say that is blind affirmative action, then you heard it here first. That's not at all what I mean. I mean, there are established, I want to swear so badly, but I won't. There are established problems that have been problems for hundreds of years and are less so now, thank God. But still, the difference in my reality on a daily basis versus some other people's reality on a daily basis is you can't argue it. It's just not the same thing, and it needs to be addressed. So corporately, we've got to address it. We've got the job to do legally and as good corporate citizens. In terms of the regulation of the profession, where any systemic problem, racism, sexism, creed, any discriminations built into the system that precludes the same access to entry and access to competency as any other lawyer, that is our obligation. Of course it is. And if people are experiencing practice challenges that put them in the sights of the regulator as a result, and those practice challenges are as a result of an institutional problem, then we should probably know about that too. Again, we've got our own silo. The OBA has they are the union for lawyers, and they are a fantastic union, and they do a huge amount of work, as do all of the racialized licensee groups that you mentioned a moment ago. They obviously are out there doing the heavy lifting and living the experience. So the Law Society can't do everything, but it does have an obligation to do those things within its mandate, both regulatory and corporate.
Now, Quinn, last couple questions here. I have hopefully some of my students and law students and NCA students and those looking to sort of jump into the profession. Do you have any words of wisdom or advice for them listening?
It is a hard road we've chosen as legal professionals. We have an incredible position of privilege, not only in terms of the potential economic, which drives some people into getting into the profession in the first place, but more importantly, the access we have to serve the public and some of the most vulnerable, and the unrestricted access we have to their trust and their reliance. That's hard, but it is incredibly important. And as dreamy as it might sound, I do fundamentally believe that we are the corporeal manifestations of that incorporeal concept of the rule of law, that we're really, in the end, as the last of us falls, we're what stands between civil society and the state of nature, because the state of nature is just the opposite of the rule of law. That's all it is. So what we do is hard, but it is incredibly important, and it is a fundamental, inwoven part of our civil society. It's not just a word. We are not accountants. We are not consultants. We actually sit as part of the separation of powers. We ensure, just by virtue of being here and being independent, being self-regulated, that tyranny is so much more difficult to foist upon the populace. Keep going.
And final question here, Quinn, as you seek coming back as for another, I guess it's not quite another term, I think, because it was partial there, but as you look to return back to the board as a bencher, for any lawyer that's listening that has up to 40 votes, as we've talked about, why should they consider casting a vote for you and I guess for the rest of the coalition?
Well, for me, I hope that you can hear from my answers today where my belief and interests lie. I do have the experience. I hope to God I have the intellectual capacity to handle the more complex issues and to do the hard work. And I want to do it. And it is a big job. So I hope that makes me qualified. I feel that it does. And I would ask for your vote as a result. For the Bencher Good Governance Coalition, I really do ask that you just go onto the site and take a look at the resumes of these people. If you've got questions, reach out to them. They're all accessible. They've got incredible resumes. They are smart, dedicated people who want to do the good and hard work at the Law Society.
Perfect. So thanks once again for taking the time to talk with me, and thanks for everyone for listening. Take care, everyone.
Thanks.